Welcome to Good Enough with the Trauma Therapist, a podcast dedicated to empowering you to take control of your life, learning valuable strategies for healing and looking at mental health through a trauma-informed lens. Get ready to feel empowered and confident in managing your symptoms. And now, here is your host, licensed clinical social worker, EMDR therapist, and certified clinical trauma professional, Jamie Vollmuller.
Welcome to Good Enough. I am your host, Jamie Vollmuller, and today we have the amazing Valerie Smith. Valerie is a licensed clinical social worker, and she runs her own counseling practice called Sugar Maple Counseling, right, Val?
Yes.
And she also specializes in forest therapy, which is super interesting. And we didn't even talk about that prior to the show, Val, but you're going to have to talk about that on here because I feel like our listeners could definitely benefit from understanding what forest therapy is and how it's beneficial. And for anyone in New York, Sugar Maple Counseling is located in New York. And Val is like one of the only certified people around here, right?
Yes.
Okay. So for those of you who do not know Valerie, I know Val very well. She was a clinician that used to work in my practice, and I was privileged enough to be her supervisor for many years. So I know that Val is a trauma kid and is super into her work and passionate about her clients and the modality she uses because of the impact it's made on her life. So Val, for those of us who don't know you here, why don't you get into why you got into this field and what made you so passionate about the work you do?
Oh, yes, of course. And yes, and thank you for the opportunity to be able to meet up with you again to speak and do this podcast and everything. Yeah, just jumping off what Jamie said. Yes, I did work for Jamie. I accrued my clinical hours under her. So really she gets the credit here. But yeah. But so I think therapists kind of have this universal understanding that they tend to come from a lot of adverse events. They have definitely been challenged. This is one of those fields where people don't just wake up one day and they're just like, I'm going to be a therapist. No, that's not why it happens. And it's more so that we therapists have been through something and we're trying to make sense of why that happened to us and bring meaning to it so we can justify this cruelty, for lack of a better word. And these this maltreatment that we had to go through. Usually, we therapists were helped by other therapists during our times of hardship. And, we feel compelled to then return that favor to the world. So in my case, I grew up in a very, very chaotic environment. My mother had severe untreated mental illness. And my father as well. It's more than likely my mother had a combination of extremely severe postpartum depression and also untreated borderline personality. She went through a lot of trauma herself. She was sexually assaulted and never was able to talk about it. She did have a forced abortion. She lost her parents when she was young, and she also lost her brother and her sister. Her only surviving brother lived all the way in Alaska. So, she went through a lot.
Yeah.
And my father, my understanding is that he was a very different person before I knew him. He was said to be very, very loving, but my father had a brain aneurysm actually when a few years before I was born, and he had to get neurosurgery. And apparently ever since then, his personality had been altered. Just to give some background to all of this. So the reason why I bring all of this up is that, as a result of all of this trauma that my own parents went through, it was inflicted onto me and onto my brother. I grew up witnessing a lot of domestic violence. Child Protective Services was involved in my life, but I wasn't removed from the house. I was one of those children who was subpoenaed to court pretty often, which is traumatic in and of itself. It's
Yeah.
very difficult to see your own father in handcuffs and just to sit there but not be able to say anything at all.
Yeah.
Um, and my mother had a love affair with vodka, where even with detox and rehab, she would not get better.
Yeah.
So
So
I
it made life very difficult for you
yes,
growing up.
yes,
Um,
and this was exacerbated too by the fact that I was basically the wallflower at school.
mm,
So I didn't really have any support among my peers either. I was an easy target to bully. I was
yeah.
very inhibited. I was shut down and disassociated from all this stuff going on at home. So the, the truth is, I didn't really feel comfortable anywhere
Yeah.
except out in the woods, which is probably why I ended up getting into forest therapy. And I'll get into that later in the podcast. But the woods for me was was my church,
Mhm.
my spiritual mother. It was the place where I could retreat to, where knew I really could get away from all of the fighting and have some solitude. So
Yeah.
I spent most of my formative years, um, growing up among the oak and beech trees. And I really found a lot of solace in being among the wild things. And then that's where my heart really grew and where I came to find out who I am.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's one thing me and Val share is our love of nature. She's probably one of the only other people I know that can identify like random plants in the woods and tell you where to where to get the stuff to get the poison ivy off you. All that jazz. But that comes from, that was your major coping skill is just being out there in nature and like letting that regulate your nervous system.
Yes.
Um, because that's such a major part of, and because we're already getting into it. So Val, can you just explain to people what forest therapy is? So I know it's based on Shirin Roku, and you're going to go into all, I'm going to let you just talk. You're
Yes.
better at this than me.
So it is based on Shirin-yoku, which is Japanese forest bath. Um, and essentially, how forest bathing came around is that in the 1980s, when Japan was becoming hyper industrialized, the Japanese government realized, this isn't a good thing. Everyone's getting sick of all of a sudden. They're all coming down with these stress related diseases. So they needed a solution to combat this.
Yeah.
And a lot of research went into it and they realized the obvious, pulling from their Shintoism and everything, that nature is good for you.
Mm.
Um, and for whatever reason, they had to spend a lot of money to prove this through research. But um, it was discovered through a lot of research by Dr. Queen Ling, actually, at Nippon University, that forest bathing has a multitude of health benefits for us. So we all know by default the cliche of you go outside, you feel better. But that's actually true. So
It
what's
is.
going on is that when we're outside in green spaces, and especially when we're around evergreens, we are reacting to a bioactive chemical that's called phytonicid. And this is a property that's given off by trees. This is a healing property that really does increase our uptake of serotonin, so we feel better, but also it increases our production of natural killer cells, which are the same cells that boost our immunity and help fight off cancers. So when you go outside and you feel better on a walk, it's not just your mind playing with you, you really are feeling better from a walk. So, how forest therapy comes into this is that forest therapy is based on Shinrin-yoku, but is not exactly Shinrin-yoku. In Shinrin-yoku, it really is just about the health benefits you're getting from being outside. Forest therapy takes it a little bit further by having it also be about reciprocity with the earth. So, the earth helps us, we help the earth. One of the ways this is done is first by, in ceremony, always acknowledging the original inhabitants of that land, um, you know, indigenous peoples. So for instance, where I live, I'm in the Hudson Valley. That would be the Wappingers and so forth. We open with acknowledging that and that they are the actual stewards of the land. We then break into a series of these different meditations, for lack of a better word. They're actually called invitations. And it begins first with the powers of presence, which is where we just take in what's going on around us. I like to compare it to if you are blind and for the very first time you've been granted the gift of sight and just everything is coming in at you at once. We then do what's called what's in motion, which is what it sounds like. And you're just paying attention to what's going on in motion. It doesn't necessarily have to be an animal. It could just be how the sun is filtering through the trees or something. But
Yeah.
it's a very mindful attempt to slow down and just be in that space. Forest therapy doesn't even have to include much space at all. Technically, if you really wanted to, you could do it in a parking lot just staring at a tree. But stating the obvious, the more green it is, probably the more you're going to get out of it.
Yeah.
It then moves into these different invitations that I craft depending on the people at the time, the season, the weather, or whatever. So I have one, for instance, that's called Autumn's Portrait. And that's where everyone's just given one of those, photo mat things and they carry it around trying to take in, quote unquote, these different pictures. Then they bring them back. They discuss that. I also do one where people go out and they collect different things like, acorns, branches, rocks, whatever. They bring that back, make a group mandala. Or another one is what I call the wisdom of stone. And this is actually one that I did when I was training out in the Rocky Mountains. I was told to find a random stone that called to me and just stop and have it, quote unquote, talk to me, see if I could envision what it had to tell me. And the reason why stones are probably the perfect being for this is that, stating the obvious, stones are extremely ancient. So in this belief system, they carry the most wisdom. But really, I can craft it for essentially anything. Like I could.
I remember there was a few years back, Val took me and my husband and my son out and she did like a guided forest therapy thing because I had never done it before. And you did this activity where we built bird nests. And it was, I just remember it being like such a grounding experience because really what you're just talking about, like paying attention to our senses, right? Like paying attention to the fact that like if you really listen, you could hear the leaves rustle and you can hear the squirrel running up the tree and you can hear the birds chirping and the crickets and the cars way off in the distance when we're at that park. And it was very, very grounding. And my son is super sensory seeking. And I just remember him like being really excited that day because he got to like get all of it out, but it was like in a very I guess like contained way. Like it was very therapeutic for him to be able to interact with his environment in that way, because I don't think we're really taught to do that. Like no one really teaches us to sit and be still anymore. And and what I love about it too is that you don't need to be still, because for my son and for me, being still is not a thing that we enjoy. I think that's probably why you like nature too. It's like the quiet is sometimes deafening. And when you grow up in a household where there's a lot of chaos, like quiet usually means like shit's about to hit the fan.
Yeah.
So for us, like, for me being in nature, I love the fact that like I can look at all these different things and hear all these different things. And like I make games out of it with my kids because it's just so it just helps them to concentrate. And it really does make us feel better.
And I'm glad to hear that, and that it does that for you. I think what's important to recognize in it too, though, is that this is also probably one of the best treatments available for the behavioral issues that our youth are experiencing today.
Yeah.
Adolescent depression, anxiety, ADHD is through the roof. And so much of this, I think, comes down to the fact that no one goes outside anymore.
Yeah.
And really stop and think about that. When we see kids outside these days, it's now because it's some sort of extracurricular activity. But we never see kids go outside anymore just to kick a ball or just to play with leaves or whatever it is. And this is something that's been lost. And it's very unfortunate. But for anyone who's interested in learning more about that, there is a book called The Last Child of the Woods, and it explores all of this in great detail. The author in it coined the term nature deficit disorder. And it's a pop psych term, obviously, but he does make a very valid argument throughout the book that because we have been so cut off from nature, it's causing serious concerns for our children.
I would tend to agree with that. They're just so, especially with that combined with the screens,
Mhm.
and it creates this. It's like an alternate. It's not the real world. Like being physically in nature is real world. Being like staring into a screen at something that's crafted and edited for your viewing, I think definitely has a lot to do with why all our kids are so.
Yeah, and, and I like to joke that it's almost kind of hypocritical for me because in my day-to-day work, I am a telehealth therapist.
Yeah.
But all of that said, though, I have managed to keep my 15-month-old off of screens, and I'm proud of myself for that. I give the exception to Miss Rachel because she's Miss
She's
Rachel.
amazing.
She's my dream wife. Okay, she's wonderful. It's like she can move in, it's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, but she's wonderful. But that aside, I have made a very, very concentrated effort to really try to limit screen use for him.
Yeah.
And I am lucky to say that I live on 2 acres in the woods. I'm in a very, very quiet town. There's really not much else to do in this town, actually, besides go outside. But I think it's working out.
That's a really amazing accomplishment, Val. I'm gonna give you props there because no screen time, save Miss Rachel. But it is a big thing, and it is super important because especially if your kids is one of those high needs, sensory seeking ADHD kids, the more screens that they have, the worse off that they are.
Yes.
And that's a battle that I have with my family actually quite often because my son, like all kids, he loves video games. He would love to sit on a tablet all day. But when he does, his mood is he has such an attitude. Like it's just a different kid if you give him a screen and let him sit in front of it for hours than if I'm like, all right, we're going to play outside. And that's pretty much at this point, Mikey's 6. Um, that's what we do. He has to like earn any TV, any screen that he has. He has to earn it, and it's usually only for like a half hour because it's just if you give it to them like unsupervised, yeah, it'll babysit your kid for the day. But you also have to realize what is your kid watching on that screen, right? Because they're also picking up all of that behavior, and it's really I feel like in the society today, it's almost like screens and social media is like raising our kids instead of us raising our kids, and we're wondering why they are materialistic and not spewing the morals that we'd like them to because you didn't raise them with your morals. You you let the world raise.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Soapbox.
But it definitely is a pressure that we face as parents. And I get it too. I don't think any parent really goes out of the way to deliberately introduce their child to a screen. It's just that they're trying to get something done.
Yeah.
Or whatever it is. But it still is something that we as parents have to be mindful of.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's easier to not introduce it than to try to wean them off.
Yeah. Yeah.
That I will tell you. And yeah, you're right. It's because we're all just kind of in survival mode. And sometimes you're like, I can't take this kid screaming. I'm going to put them in front of the TV. And that does happen.
And I think sometimes too, it's also just because we are afraid that if we let our child do some sort of chore or something, they could get injured in the process. It feels safer just to, put them in the playpen and put on the TV. And that's really where I've had to challenge myself. I fully admit I've let Skylar help unload the dishwasher with me. And I just think like, please don't drop that plate. He hasn't. So, but he's a good little worker. He is.
And they love that too. And it's also bonding time, Val.
Yes.
Like I think that, we have a lot of moms that listen to this podcast. And I think that's one of the things that people will say all the time is I don't have time. But when we start to involve our kids in our day-to-day stuff, then we have all the time, right? Because they're doing it with us. And I find that my kids love that. Like if I'm like, hey, come help. Like if I'm like, I have to make dinner, I can't play with you, they're upset. But if I'm like, hey, come help me make the tortillas to make our tacos, and I have them like do it's a bit messier, I will tell you, but it makes them happy. They eat more because they contributed, and they don't feel like they're pushed aside because they're with you the whole time. And then because you're doing these need to do activities with them and you're building stuff like that into your schedule, you're spending more time with your kids, and you do wind up raising your kids, which is wonderful.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah. You're spot on about that. There's a book that explores this as well. It's called Hunt, Gather, Parent, and
okay.
I can't remember the name. I can never remember names of authors, but she did an experiment where she lived among 3 different indigenous tribes for a few years, and what all these tribes have in common is that they all raise their kids from the start to be into chores, to really be helpful and be participants in the family. And she found out that they all are soaring with confidence, and they feel included, and they feel like they have some sort of worth and some sort of matter. I think something that happens in Western society a lot is that instead we have this focus on, okay, mommy does this, daddy does this, you do this.
Mhm.
And it just makes them think, all right, so not only am I not allowed to help with this, but I'm getting the impression that they don't even want my help. And
Yeah.
again, these are things that no parent wants their child to think that. It's just, it
No,
happens because we get caught up in the day to day and we think, you know what, if I just clean the kitchen myself, I can get it done
it's
in
easier.
minutes. If they
Mhm.
help me, it's actually going to get messier. But that's also the only way they're going to learn as well.
True.
Yeah.
That's 110% true, because it does take a little longer to like stay on them to teach them the things that they need to do it correctly. But once they know how to do it correctly, then they're just going to do it correctly every day. Like, and then your life's easier.
Yeah. And you know, it's interesting watching the payoff. When Skylar was very young, I got into this routine of just doing chores in front of him all of the time. And so every day for like a year, he watched me fold laundry. And I tried to have fun with it and, you know, some vocabulary like, this is my green blouse. This is your ducky onesie. This is daddy's blue shirt.
Mhm.
And I'd take like bibs and things and quote unquote make it rain and sing songs about rain. And then one day he actually went to the dryer and started like putting stuff into the dryer. And I was like, oh, wow. I didn't teach him that. He just learned it through observation. Okay,
Yeah.
cool. Yeah.
That's amazing. I think one of the reasons I've always vibed with you, Val, is because, and especially when you were getting pregnant, you're going to be a mother. I think one thing that we both really struggled with being from families that we did not want to be our parents, right? Like that was
Yeah.
very big for both of us, is like, how do we do this differently? Um, and that's pretty much what this whole podcast is about. Like, how do we break intergenerational trauma? And I know for you, because I apologize, guys. I interrupted Val's story we, because I know her story and I didn't let her finish. I'm sorry. But Val lost her parents very early on. And having a kid, even when you didn't lose your parents, brings up a lot of stuff. But I'm sure it brings up even more stuff when they're not around to experience those big life milestones. And that was something when Val is part of my practice. She says she was everything to me. Val was like the grief expert. She was Val is amazing. Job. She's an amazing clinician. And especially when it came to the grief work, she was really our go-to, especially for younger adults that were dealing with life transitions after losing a parent, because it's a very different experience. And we haven't really talked since I guess the kids grew up. So like I kind of wanted to get into that with you. Like, how do you feel that like what are you doing now differently as a parent to prevent Skylar from going through what you're going through? Because I feel like that's really what we're both talking about, is like how we parent a lot differently than what our parents did.
Um, so one of the things I did is that I know my limitations. And with that said, I do not have any alcohol at all in my house. Now, if I have friends over and they want to bring some beer and wine, that's fine. And I'm not saying I'm not going to let myself not have a glass of wine. It's just, I know my limitations.
Yeah.
And I know that even though I've never had a drinking problem, I do have that gene.
Yeah.
I do have that natural tendency. My mother was not the only alcoholic in my family. So it's just that her effect and her loss hit me the most. So I'm very, very cautious with that. Something else that I'm intentional about is that my husband and I, back when we were family planning and everything, you know, really decided to work on ourselves. We both got therapy. We're both still in therapy. I side note to anyone, I recommend everyone be in therapy.
Yeah.
And if your therapist is not in therapy, your therapist should be in therapy too.
If your therapist is not in therapy, you should get another therapist.
Yes.
If your therapist has never been in therapy, especially, you should definitely go.
Yes. Because just going back 20 minutes ago, every single therapist comes from something. And if they have not processed that, they can actually make things worse for their clients. But
Yeah.
I don't want to get too off topic. That's a completely different topic.
But one of the things that you said, Val, that I think was really important too is the like how when we're doing it differently, right? Crap, what did you say? Now I'm gonna have to edit this out. Damn it. I'm running on 2 hours of sleep, girl. I'm sorry.
You just had a little one, and
she's only 6 weeks old. She's super cute. No, you said something about God.
I'm running 4 hours of sleep too. Skylar's teething, so.
But I think one of the things that we both do that's different about our families is what you were talking about earlier is the shared, there's no gender roles in our parenting, right? So I know like your household runs a lot like mine. Like it's not like mom's role to cook or dad's role to cook or mom's role to clean or change diapers or, it's who's ever home and whoever has the hands to do it at the time. And I think that's super important because especially raising boys, right? Like you have a boy, I have 2 boys. My boys don't mind cooking because they don't think that cooking is a woman's job. Their dad cooks all the time. Their dad loves to bake. That's normally something that people say they bake with their mom. My kids bake with their dad because he loves to bake. And I think that the lack of gender roles and making it more of a shared partnership was a really big and it's one thing, but it's such a major thing because your whole household and environment is it's a ripple effect.
Yes.
Because everything is shared and you're teaching about I think when in Western society, women bear so much of that burden because it's constantly preached to us that we're selfish if we ask for help. We should be able to do it all. Our jobs as moms come first. And if we prioritize ourselves in any way, then if we prioritize ourselves, then we're looked at as the bad ones. And that doesn't really come across to men quite as much. So when your kids are raised in a household where your parents actually have each other's back, and it's clearly an equal partnership where they both have decision-making power and openly talk about things, it really changes the way that they grow up based on that modeling, like you were talking about earlier too, of they know now how to have a healthy relationship because what we were modeled was not what is healthy. It's not good communication skills. It's not going to make them feel, wanted or secure or any of that.
Yes, most definitely. And I really have to thank my husband, Will, for being so involved in everything. I just from the start, he was. I think he's probably changed more diapers than I have, full disclosure. He's much better at it. But I remember too, even when I was just very freshly postpartum and we were both sleep deprived and everything, something that happens to so many mothers, especially ones who are breastfeeding, is that they get stuck being up all the time because they see it as, all right, well, I'm the one that can feed this baby. And then their partner, I think, ends up feeling inadequate. So that's why they pull away and they end up doing less. But really, that's a time when the father can be stepping up, cleaning the pump parts or something, making sure the mother's comfortable, helping rock the baby back to sleep because the breastfeeding's exhausting. All of that is. But I think that's really what happens to men in it. They just think I'm useless and I might mess up if I even try to help.
Yeah, I think my husband felt like that with my first. I also, full disclosure, had really bad postpartum anxiety. So I got nervous every time that he cried. But I'm sure I probably contributed that too because I didn't do a good job of letting him console the child and figure it out on his own. Number 3 is going much better though. And it does work when, and if you're one of those women, tell them what to do. So if you're one of those women who have a husband who's like what Val is saying, they seem like they feel like they don't know what to do, tell them what to do. And I had to do that with my husband. My first, I had to literally make him a list of like, here are all the things like you would a babysitter. But honestly, it's probably more detailed than a babysitter because I feel like men don't look for things as well as women, I guess. My list with my husband is super, super detailed. But if you just tell them what to do, then they can contribute and you feel better. And for me now, like with my daughter at home, I breastfeed. Very, very big proponent of breastfeeding over here. But my husband can't feed my daughter, and it doesn't make sense for him to feed her because then I have to pump. But what he will do for me now is go get the other kids and let me sleep in the morning and make sure that like some of the stuff that I need if he's working the next morning is ready for me so that my mornings go smoother because he knows that I was probably up all night with the baby. And there are plenty of things like that you could do that also, again, are setting amazing example for your kids of what a partnership looks like, because that is super, super, super important.
Yeah, definitely.
But yeah, so the partnership is a big part of the changing the intergenerational trauma. I think another thing for us too is the amount of time we spend is a big one. That's very different from the childhood that I had. And I think both of us as moms, like we were very like wanted a job where we didn't have to have that traditional be at work all the time.
Yes.
And I don't know about you, but like my mom was a single mom. So my mom worked a lot. My dad worked a lot. I was in a lot of child care growing up, and it's not because my mother didn't love me. It's because the woman worked multiple jobs to make sure that our bills were paid. Right. But if we have the option not to do that and to spend the time with our kids, that's pretty much one of the biggest, indicators in research of whether, like, even if your kids are bullied, right? Because I was bullied in high school, you were bullied in high school. If you have a really strong support system at home, that's a really great buffer to all of that, because no matter what, your child knows they're loved, they know they're important, they know that they matter. And I think that a lot of the failings of parents in general, but I think the previous generation was people would say, like, people can say, I love you, but if you're not spending time with your kids and you're not showing up for them and being really present, like, and mentally present is important too, because like you said, if your mom has depression or if your mom has an addiction to alcohol, she's not really present and she can't be there for you. So if we are emotionally present for them, then they're going to grow up a hell of a lot more resilient than we did. And I think we were pretty damn resilient kids. So I guess we agree.
I think so. And you bring up something that I would like to touch on, and just the complexities of growing up in a very abusive family.
Mm-hmm.
That emotional presence is key. I agree with you completely. On the surface, people would think that by default, I probably had a better relationship with my mom, just for the simple fact that it was my father who was physically abusive and not my mom.
Mm-hmm.
The truth is, I have a lot more holdups with my mother. My father was indeed a very violent person, and what he did was wrong. I saw absolutely horrific, horrific things. But what made my relationship with him so dialectical and everything is that he was horrible to her, but to me, he was available. I actually have very, very fond memories of just my father and I, canoeing and things like that. And he was the one that took me prom dress shopping and things like that. My mother was not involved in that way. My mother never laid a hand on me, but she was pretty much always passed out drunk, or she was threatening suicide. So when you're a child, that definitely leaves an impact on you. And it also leaves an impact on how you feel about them as an adult. And so through a lot of my own work in therapy, I really had to just come to realize that my parents did the best they could with the resources they had. And given that they didn't have the education I do and everything to be able to push through this.
Yeah, I feel like that was a lot of, like you said, we all become therapists, I think, to work through our own stuff. And that was my parents too. They really did the best they can. They weren't bad people. No one just because we're saying that we have trauma, guys, doesn't mean that we don't love our parents. Like Val very much loved her parents. I very much love my parents. But it doesn't mean that what they did wasn't hurtful, even if they were doing the best that they could. And without acknowledging that, you can't really heal, move forward, or make any changes. And if we accept that if we accept how they treated us as truly acceptable, we're not going to change our behavior in the next generation, because we're going to start, co-signing on our own nonsense that we know is wrong because, oh, well, we're just doing the best we can. Right. So I think there is something to acknowledging the hurt that you went through as a child, and that it's not there. And the other thing that you said that I think is really key, and it's something that we hear a lot, is emotional abuse. I feel like leaves far deeper scars than physical. Because like in that scenario, right, if you have a mother who's emotionally absent and like not showing up for you, it just feels like something must be inherently wrong with me, or they don't love me, or they're not there. If you have a parent who is physically abusive, it's likely because they're explosive and don't have very good control over their emotions, but they still do show up in other ways. And they're usually pretty apologetic that they did that. Right. And even if they're not, they're still showing you that they love you in other ways, versus that parent that is just not there, because that absence is, if we think about it, right, that absence is an everyday 24-hour a day thing. If you get, a whop, even if it hurts and it hurts for a few hours afterwards, or even a few days afterwards, it goes away.
Yeah.
That absence that doesn't go away, and the emotional turmoil you have within yourself because that person is not showing up for you, especially as a child who are prone to blame themselves, is going to be a lot more impactful on how we see ourselves and how we see the world.
Yes, it is. So, to bring this more up to date, everyone, just going back to what we were touched on a few minutes ago with me having lost my parents. So to give a little bit more context, what ended up happening is that I developed that good daughter syndrome. I was the one that was their caregiver. I made all the end of life decisions. I paid for their funerals. I did every single thing. Um, I lost my mother to septic shock when I was 22 years old. It was a complication of her having had Korsakoff syndrome and cirrhosis. I then at 34 lost my father to adenocarcinoma, which was caused by him having smoked for many years. And like I said, they both went through a lot of trauma. I'll never forget when I was at an oncology appointment with my dad, and the oncologist asked when he started smoking, and he said age 8. And the oncologist laughed and was like, okay, so like 18, right? And he's like, no, 8. I was 8. And you just have to stop and pause and think about that.
Yeah.
That an 8-year-old is smoking cigarettes. Like trauma doesn't happen out of nowhere.
Yeah.
But anyways, so to really bring this around to how this affected me as a young adult and everything.
Mm-hmm.
Let me start by saying that obviously losing a parent at any age is hurtful. It is, however, overwhelmingly normal when you're much older.
Yeah.
Parent loss is the most common phenomenon as far as deaths go. And it's the one that at one point, probably all of us will go through. It's so common, in fact, that there isn't even a word for it. Think about that. There's a word for if you lose your spouse, you're a widow or a widower. There's a term for it if you're a child and you lose your parents, you're an orphan. But there's no term for it if you're an adult losing your parents. There also isn't a term for if you lose your sibling either, I think, which is also something else worth discussing sometime. And, because of this, there's actually very little research on how parent loss affects us, even though it is so overwhelmingly common.
Yeah. And I feel like it has to be harder nowadays because the situation you were in with the caretaking, there are so many people that are in between taking care of their parents and their kids. And I think that it's a very different thing when you lose a parent when you're that close with them at the end of life versus if it's like a sudden or like a more, do you know what I'm trying to say, Val?
Yeah. Yes. I think when someone's in their 40s, 50s, 60s, or whatever, it's just also that it's more normalized. You are able to say, okay, I lost a parent. My friends and my family can relate because they did too.
Yeah.
So, what had happened with me is when my mother died, I was looking for support. And I was put into this adult group for parent loss. I truly felt like a fish out of water because I was by far the youngest person there. I even made that comment that I felt like I couldn't relate. I could only universally relate, and that just losing a parent is losing a parent. I think when someone's a young adult, what makes it particularly difficult is that they are on the cusp of independence and dependence. In so many
Mhm.
ways, they're striving to be independent. They're in college or whatever it is they're doing, but they still are connected to their parents. They still know that they can call their parents if they need that help or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Also, leaning into all of that is all these milestones that society expects our parents to be here for. They
Yeah.
expect that your parents are going to be there at the college graduation, that they're going to be there at your wedding, that they're going to be there for the birth of your child, for when you buy a house. Not like no one can buy a house these days, but um but these are all things that just go without saying. And so when these kinds of events come up, someone who's going through this feels especially alone.
Yeah.
I remember thinking about with my wedding how alone I felt in some ways, except I will give credit to my mother-in-law where it's due. She's wonderful and she really stepped up, and she and I are extremely close. But regardless, it's still not the same thing as my mom.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of things that moms aren't supposed to be involved in the wedding planning process. They're supposed to be there for the dress, for planning the shower, all sorts of things. Even if my mom was alive for that, she wouldn't have been involved though, just because she was so sick by then. But it was just a lot of a reminder of how alone I felt.
Yeah.
Uh, so in all of this, and it's actually on hiatus right now, but I ended up starting a group called Millennials in Mourning. And it's a very unique group. It's probably the only one of its kind in New York, maybe even in the tri state area. But it's exactly what it sounds like. It's for young adults who are going through parent loss. And it touches on all these things. It has a lot of a focus in particular about how it impacts us as young adults. It also focuses on other things that get affected as well, though, too, like relationships with other people. Um, So it's a lot. Ugh.
But when you ran that group, I mean, we've always got such positive feedback on the millennials and morning group because it is such a specialized thing, and I think for people that have experienced that kind of loss, just going to a regular grief group isn't really like it's not like you said, it's not the same because it's different things. It's expected that they're supposed to be there. It's that numerous times reminders and they're major life events that in our brains we picture our futures, right? So we're like mourning the memories of our future that we never got to have.
Yes, that's exactly what's happening. I remember when um, my grandmother died and I was 94. People were very, very upset about it. And to tell you the truth, and I'm not happy to admit it, but telling the truth here, um, I really didn't care all that much.
Yeah.
One of the reasons is first and foremost, like she and I weren't close, but that's a different story in and of itself. But it was really more so that I thought, she made it to 94.
Yeah.
My mother was only 57. My other grandmother was 40 something. My aunt was only 40.
Oh my God.
So I saw it as, what, this person had a life very well lived. She got to go on to even be a great grandparent. She had a very, very rich, beautiful life. And I felt that my mom got deprived of that. And that as a result, I got deprived of that as well. So now I'm just trying to rebuild that and come to define what that means. I will say it's been very bittersweet being a mom. Uh, it's the most beautiful opportunity I've ever had. And it's been my way of healing, I'd say, above all, from my complex post traumatic stress disorder. I would say, too, that it's also presented its own hardship in that I feel like my son, in a way, is going to grow up with with a very one sided family. Um,
Mm.
because everything is always with my husband's family.
Yeah.
And I do say that I have gratitude in that they really are wonderful, wonderful people. And I'm glad they're in my life. But I just meant that I wish there was a way for him to feel more connected to my own family. I am trying to make that effort though. I show him photo albums. I tell him about his other grandparents because I want him to know that. And I think it's that side of the family tree needs to be watered and that he needs to know that, my story matters in this too. I do
I
remember. Hmm?
I love that, Val. And I think that it is really beautiful that you keep their memory alive and you like make sure that they know who they were because so much of our like what we think about ourselves is our family history
Yeah.
and just educating him about why you are the way you are and who your parents were and what your traditions are is a really good way to keep him alive. But I'm sorry, what were you going to say, my love?
What was I going to say? um, oh, another time that it stung me a bit, and again, this was not at all intentional. It was just that people got a little bit too hyped in the moment. But when people started to learn that I was pregnant, I do remember my mother-in-law and her cousin being, over the moon, super excited. This was my mother-in-law's first and probably only grandchild. So I get where she's coming from. But they started just compiling this list of family names and Irish names, being like, Skylar's Irish and, family name and blah, blah, blah. And I just thought, and where am I in this? It's like,
Mm,
am I just like a freaking handmaid?
yeah.
So, and again, it was not intentional. I get it,
Yeah.
but it did hurt me a bit there. And what I'm actually really relieved about is that we just took that list and threw it out, and we just ended up going with completely our own name and everything.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that my husband felt good about that because he said, you know what, I don't want it to be that he grows up just with this one sided thing. It's important that he has his own identity. So,
Yeah. And I think it's important that his mother, feels like she's just as much part of that picture and that dad has her back and isn't gonna because family dynamics, especially in-laws, as much as we love them, can be very, very difficult, especially if we're feeling triggered and they don't know why, right? And I think that's most of the time, I honestly believe that most people are well-intentioned and good-hearted people, and that they just don't know that what they're doing is painful. Because I feel like if I really look at most of the times that I've been hurt by people that I genuinely love and care about and love, and who I know love and care about me, it's usually because they don't have the information to know that, yeah, this is a trigger for me, or like this thing just came up, or that made me think of this. And especially when you have like CPTSD, like we do, like there's so much free association that occurs in our brains and triggers that we don't even know that are there, or that we're going to be triggered by something half the time, that for us to expect everyone else to isn't great either. But I think it's beautiful that Will had your back in that way. And that just also is a reflection of how good of a relationship that is and what a true like partnership that is, that he makes that effort to know like, oh, even if Val doesn't say anything here, set this boundary, like this is something that's hard for her and I'm gonna
yeah.
step in and make that better.
Yeah. And I think, from the start, him treating me as his equal and us being partners has really been, I think, what set the foundation for us to try to break this cycle that happened in my family. Something I can really attest to is that when my father was on hospice, Will stepped up and he did everything. He was just as involved as I was. And he didn't even need to be, but he was anyway. And I think, it's important to pause and just think about what that means, because Will was someone who had heard, obviously, all this traumatic stuff. I wasn't going to keep that from him. And yet, despite that and his own reservations and wanting to protect the person he loved most, he still helped my father. He literally wiped my father's butt, changed his diapers, changed the catheter. He did all of these things that no one wants to do.
Yeah.
And he did that just because he's a good person. And so I think that's, the most important thing there is when someone wants to be a parent, to make sure that they have someone who is just as ethical as they are.
Well, and that your values align, right? Because
Yeah.
I know, like, I maybe it's because we know better than, or we like planning, but I know, like you, I had multiple conversations with my husband before we got married about raising children and what that would look like and what would happen if, like, all these different scenarios, because there are things that happen in the world that are very much based on our value system. And if we're not discussing our value system and making sure the person that we love is on board with all of these things, that's how I think that's why the divorce rate's so high in this country, because one, either people don't talk about it or they expect the other person to change their opinion. But people generally aren't going to change their opinion, especially if you're not willing to talk about it. But we do need to start wrapping up, Val. So I want to let you tell everyone if they would like, because I know you said that you don't have many openings now, but I'm going to let you speak on who you work with, where people can reach you.
Sure. And again, thank you for letting me pop on today to talk and everything. So I specialize in a few different things. To anyone who's interested, I am an EMDR therapist, and I'm also right now currently going for my DBT certification. I've already been doing DBT for a long time, but now I'm actually really getting it official out on paper. I work mostly with people who have complex PTSD. I also work with people who are experiencing grief and loss. Stating the obvious, I focus mostly on young adults who are going through parent loss, but really all losses. I also do focus a lot on new motherhood. I absolutely love working with new moms. And I think that's something that brings me a lot of joy. I had pretty severe postpartum depression early on, and I feel better now. And I like to be able to extend that outward. I get that being a new mom is a huge change, and what that comes with that. So, and I also do caregiving stress as well. I can be reached at sugarmaplecounseling.com. That's one L, not two. If you type in it with two L's, it's going to take you to a practice in Ontario. I'm not in Ontario. Yeah. Yeah. I also do forced therapy walks in the Hudson Valley. I am in the Yorktown Heights area. So if you're around here, come find me. I do have 2 walks coming up very soon. I have one coming up on October 8th at the Putnam Valley Library. I have one coming up on October 20. I forgot the day off the top of my head. Wow. Okay. At the very end of October, through the Putnam Valley Grange.
So Val, if you send me those, I'll put them in the show notes so that people can click the link and they can easily find those events.
Oh, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Yeah. It was really lovely having you on. I love you as a human being. So you made this very, very easy for me. And I hope our listeners enjoyed, because Val is cut from the same cloth. She is just an amazing, amazing human. If you're struggling with any of those issues, Val also accepts insurance.
Yes.
Correct?
Yes.
Val, which insurances do you accept so our listeners know?
I take Blue Cross Blue Shield, Aetna, Cigna, Optum, Oscar, United Healthcare.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So Val accepts insurance. You can meet her virtually. You can also head up to Hudson Valley and take a beautiful walk in the woods. I'm telling you, it's really worth the experience, guys. If you've never done anything like it, I thought that forest therapy when I did it with Val was just truly amazing. And honestly, even now when I go on walks with my kids, some of the things that you had them do, I will like prompt them to do it because it's basically just having them be mindful in nature. And what's better than that? I want to thank everyone for listening, and I want to remind you guys that you are good enough.
Thank you for listening to Good Enough with the Trauma Therapist. We appreciate you listening. While our host may provide some personal and professional advice, we want to remind you that this show is for entertainment purposes only. Each individual situation is unique, and Good Enough is not a substitute for mental health treatment. If you need a therapist and are located in New York or Missouri, feel free to reach out to us at liendr.com or resilient-mo.com.